Very much. I'm very happy to be here in Leuven. Thank you, Sasha, for inviting me, and I'm very happy that I can share my research, which comes from this book today. I'm also very kind of how can I say it? I think it's also interesting that this book gained much more interest from the side of sport historians than avant-garde scholars. So I think it's a good also for me opportunity to talk about it today and bring some topics which might maybe also interest you, and I hope for a fruitful discussion after the talk. And just to let you know that the book really kind of still didn't get much recognition within avant-garde studies. I mean, it's fresh. I mean, it got published last year. But I hope that this seminar can also bring it more to the focus for the avant-garde scholars and not only the sport historians. But at the beginning, I need to start with sport, because to contextualize the worker sport, so the topic which is not so broadly known among the art historians or literature scholars. And I would like to talk about three important aspects of the worker sports movement and how avant-garde artists engaged with worker sports in Czechoslovakia, in Soviet Union and in Hungary. But before I will start talking about the worker sport, I would like to just briefly kind of set the basic and introduction about what was happening actually in the modern sports from the end of the 19th century. So just to have a brief introduction about the global sports movement at that time, which emerged by the end of the 19th century, and especially I would like to mention, of course, the International Olympic Committee, which was a major committee to kind of govern the Olympic Games and revive it in the 1996. It was led by Pierre de Coubertin, and who had the idea to revive the Greek Olympics in the modern times. And the first Olympic Games were opened in Athens in 1896, then Paris 19, St. Louis 1904, London 1908, Sweden 1912, and Antwerp 1920. I think the Olympic Games are also very important to look upon that topic, how sport emerged globally. Also, I think it's important to kind of make the reflection that women, for example, participated for the first time at the 19 Paris Games with the inclusion of women's events in lawn tennis and golf. I mean, there were two disciplines women could compete, but until 1928, women were not invited to participate in the athletics, for example. So only the ninth edition of the Olympic Games enabled women to participate, because Baron Pierre de Coubertin wanted kind of to model the Olympic Games on the Greek tradition, and in ancient Greece women were not allowed to participate in the Olympics. But anyway, so this is also an important point I would like to refer later, talking about the Workers' Olympics. This what was also very important during the Olympic Games were the so-called Olympic art competitions, which were started in 1912 and ended in 1948. And artists, just like sportsmen and athletes, were gaining medals for such disciplines as painting, sculpture, architecture, music, and literature. Actually, I was also researching that topic. Not many avant-garde artists exhibited at those Olympic art competitions, but as far as I studied that topic. In 1928, during the Olympic Games in Amsterdam, George Grosz exhibited a painting of Max Schmeling. Walter Gropius exhibited in architecture in the 1932 during the Olympic art competition in Los Angeles, and in the 1936 Olympic art competition in Berlin. For example, a lot of Italian futurists exhibited. Of course, which makes sense when we think about Italian futurism as a political movement close to fascism and that sort of thing. So, I mean, the question how much avant-garde they were in 1936 is also a question, but I think it's also important to kind of know that during the Olympic Games also artists gained medals and also they were included in the medal table, which is I think very interesting because for example I remember that in 1928 Amsterdam Olympics like Polish artists received a bronze medal, Władysław Skoczylas, and he was like in the medal table next to the sportsman, next to the athlete. So this was also the idea of the Baron Pierre de Coubertin to show that like Olympic Games and the cultural events, just like in the ancient Greece, are not separated, but they are forming a kind of unit. So this only as a background to the workers' sport movement, because workers' sport movement was a kind of a counter-Olympic movement. They were against the bourgeois Olympic Games, as they called, and they formed the first workers' clubs. They were formed by the end of the 19th century. As far as the sports scholars are researching, the Arbeiter-Turnbund from Gera from 1893 was the first workers' club established there. And another one was in Czechoslovakia, the Nicka Telowychowna Jednota in Prague in 1897. And also its important event, there was an important event in Ghent in 1913, which was supposed to create the first organization which will be a counter-organization to the International Olympic Committee. So it would be an organization which kind of brings together all the workers' clubs and workers' sports movements all around the world at that time. But only this one event happened, but during the First World War, unfortunately, the concept of creating a kind of international organization of workers' sport was not possible because of the First World War. So I also would like to direct the attention that workers' sport movement was very diverse. I mean, it was on the one hand governed by socialists, and on the other hand, communists. And the communists had much more paramilitary goals and connected very much the workers' sport movement with training to train the worker's body and prepare him for the future, the class struggle. And for example, if the socialists had a tradition in worker sport, in sporting organizations, the communists had much more the tradition in the paramilitary organizations, like for example Vsevoluk in Soviet Russia, which was a military organization and operated during the Russian Civil War. On the other hand, one of the first communist workers' sports club was a federation of the sports clubs in Prague, in Czechoslovakia, founded in 1921 and governed by the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, which organized the first Spartacades. But I will come to that. So, kind of sum up this kind of a basic information about worker sport and how they operated against the International Olympic Committee, for example. It's important to underline that the first organization, modeled on the International Olympic Committee, was established in 1920. It was Lucerne Sport International. And in 1921, Red Sport International in Moscow. Lucerne Sport International was responsible for creating Workers' Olympiads, or Workers' Olympics. The Socialists won, and the Red Sport International was kind of responsible for creating the Communists' Spartakiads. So I think it's also important to kind of underline that both the workers' sports from the socialist side and from the communist side, they were hostile to each other. They couldn't kind of find the same language to create a common kind of structure for the global workers' sports movement. Of course, the communists were more radical, the socialists were more moderate. But I think this is what is also very important, is that like around 5 million members were included in both socialists, Lucerne Sport International and the Red Sport International. So you can imagine like how big this movement was, like 5 million people, it's really a lot. And here I just like have selected some random quotations to just like show you how they kind of positioned themselves. And during the first Workers' Olympics in Frankfurt, one of the major organizer was saying that the bourgeois Olympic Games will always be married by the unspirit of nationalism, since the capitalist world knows no true reconciliation. Our Olympics are based on understanding and reconciliation between the peoples. In our Olympics, nations do not compete against each other, but athletes from all countries compete together as comrades. We all have the same enemy, capitalism, which has created and nurtures nationalism. We do not give laurel wreaths to nations, and we do not fly their flags. Instead, we unite as brothers and sisters under the flag of socialism. I think it's also important to underline that because Germany lost the First World War, they were not invited to the Olympic Games in Antwerp in 1920 and 1924 in Paris. And the first Olympic Games where Germany participated after the war was the 1928 in Amsterdam, so very late. So actually also this first Workers' Olympics in Frankfurt was meant to present also the German athletes outside of the system of the Olympic Games at this event. And I think it's also interesting to show that there were no flags, only the nations' names, and there was no medals or like podiums for the athletes, only they received a diploma for the participation. Yeah. So this is kind of a basic information about that topic. But for example, the first Workers' Olympics in Frankfurt, the organizer did not invite the Soviet athletes. And also I think it's important to have in mind that Soviet Union did not participate either in Olympic Games until 1952, nor in the Workers' Olympics created by socialists, because they were saying that like the socialists are traitors to the working class struggle. And for example, here is one of the quotations from the status of Red Sport International, who are saying that the reformist Lucerne Sport International helps the bourgeois with its policy of using sport to deliver the workers from the revolutionary class tasks of the proletariat. I think, like, of course, the communist workers' sport was much more paramilitary, like with those goals to prepare the workers for the class struggle. So here, as a very broad kind of timeline, I would like to show that just like simultaneously to the given Olympic Games, there were workers' Olympics. The first edition in Frankfurt, then the second edition in Vienna, and the third edition in Antwerp. And the Prague editions were much more local. They were not. They are not counted as an event organized by the Socialist or Lutheran Sport International. The Olympic Games in Paris, Amsterdam, Los Angeles, and Berlin, 1936, and the Spartakiads, the first organized by the Red Sport International, was in Moscow. I mean, it was not the first, because the first was organized in Prague. I will also talk about it. The second Spartakiad in Berlin was cancelled, in Barcelona was cancelled because of the outbreak of the Spanish Civil War. And as you see, the third Workers' Olympics, organized by Socialists and Red Sport International together, was in 1937. So they realized that they need to kind of work together as a one organization, especially when we see the context of the Berlin Olympics in 1936, which was organized in Nazi Germany. So actually the Antwerp Workers' Olympics, which was the first Workers' Olympics organized both by socialists and communists, was also the last one. Both organizations dissolved around 1937, 1938. So this is like to give a more kind of a context to what was going on in the sports history, because when we think about sport history, we think much more about Olympic Games, but when you think about those two other ways of creating a huge international sporting events by 5 million members, I think we need to take into account the worker sport movement, which was such a big thing at that time, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, but also Belgium, especially when you think about the West. So this is a more of a context. I still am coming to my talk. I also would like to kind of I wanted to make this book like one of the first books which looks upon the worker sport as a very important frame for the workers' culture. And when we think about the books which were published about the workers' culture topic, of course the worker photography movement, it's related to workers' photography, and theatre agitprop to the workers' theatre, the theatre as a weapon to workers' theatre. But actually, the story of worker sport, which was it's kind of a major book on the international variants of the worker sport movement, was published by sport historians, and like no visual materials were interpreted or cultural events. Like it was more about the medal tables. I mean, it's also very important, like how many members, like how it's differed from each other. I mean, not medal tables, because the workers' sports athletes, they didn't get medals, but like, for example, about the records. So I think it's so this book I found I wanted to publish this book as a kind of first publication which would deal both with workers' photography because the workers photographed the sporting events. Also the theater is very important, and avant-garde, because a lot of avant-garde artists actually were engaged with creating a propaganda for the workers' sport movement when we think about how mass movement it was. And I would like to start with Czech Avant-Garde and Spartakiads in Prague. And then I will go to Soviet Union and Hungary. So actually, the first unofficial Workers' Olympics and first unofficial Spartakiads, which were not governed by Lutheran Sport International nor by Red Sport International, were organized in Prague in 1921. Actually, it's very interesting to underline that the name Spartakiads, a lot of people associate with Soviet Union, but the term was coined in Czechoslovakia by the member of the Czechoslovak Communist Party, Jiří Chaloupecki, and he was one of the major organizers of the first Spartakiad in Prague. So when we see this this photograph here, it was an event, like a performance, devoted to the victory of the revolution, created by Jindřich Honzl. He was a major theater director, avant-garde theater director in Czechoslovakia and member of a Devetsil group, who created and staged the victory of the revolution during the first Spartakiads in Prague in 1921. Actually, Honzl was very much interested in sports and also in a magazine called Disc from 1923. And he wrote, "Sport is theater. The meaning of sport rests in fact that a crowd of thousands visit matches. Sport is not a healthy expression of an organically healthy individual in society. Sport is the subject of human poeticism." So actually he kind of aestheticized sport at the one time, writing it in Disc. But on the other hand, sport was very much also political for him, because he created the performances during the first Spartakiad in Prague, and also prepared another performance for the second Spartakiad in Prague, which did not happen in 1928. As we see also as we think also about the artists related to the Devetsil group from Czechoslovakia, they were all somehow connected to the Communist Party. Not every one of them was a member, but they kind of followed the path. Also, Karel Teige wrote about sport as a very important phenomenon. For example, in 1922, in this volume Devetsil, he wrote that art should be as much spiritual hygiene as sport is physical hygiene. Let us equate art with sport or acrobatics, rather than with mysticism, metaphysics, and religion. So looking at sport, and also he most probably had in mind the worker sport, it's also acrobatics. It's also like a way of looking at the new art, which is not the high level art. So I think this idea of Karel Teige is very interestingly expressed in this very meaningful photomontage, you can say, or just juxtaposition of two images, where we see a single man in the gallery space, and he is standing alone in the closed environment and watches the exhibition. And on the other image, we have a crowd during the football game. So you can see the idea of new culture or new art is to bring the crowds and masses in the open space, and nothing can do it better than action sport. So the juxtaposition of both photographs expresses a clear message. A traditional art exhibition is an individual aesthetic experience, and as something inferior to the collective experience of a sporting game observed by crowds at the stadium. The exhibition might have an impact on an individual art lover who contemplates art alone in a closed gallery space, but a football match in the open air is a much more collective experience. And this is what also artists related to Devetzil were very much interested in. So this juxtaposition of those two images appeared in a magazine called Red, Revue Devetzil, the magazine edited by Karel Teiger. I don't know who did this juxtaposition. I assume it could have been Teiger himself. But on the other hand, there was one interesting article in Red in 1928 about the worker sport in Soviet Union. And here, those photographs, they are coming from the magazine Delnicka Telovychova. It was a magazine edited in Prague and devoted to the worker sport movement. And the person who wrote about the worker sport in Soviet Union was Franciszek Pisek, who was also the editor of the worker sport magazine and also a member of the Avant-Garde group. The one who translated Mayakovsky and all the Russian, also avant-garde poets and other writers. And he also belonged to the communist worker sports group in Czechoslovakia. So actually, I found it interesting that the Avant-Garde magazine, which was read, very important for the development of Czechoslovak avant-garde, also featured not only this juxtaposition of gallery experience and stadium experience, but also the article on the worker sport movement. And it contained the photographs from the workers' sport press at that time. In the 1928, the artists related to Devetzil, the avant-garde group, were also engaged in creating the second Spartakiad in Prague in 1928. And on the pages of Red, you can find the sketches by Jaromir Krejčar, who was a member of the Devetzil group, who showed some sketches of the stadium of Spartakiad. Because you also, it's also important to know that, when we think about the sport history in Czechoslovakia, there was not only the Olympic movement, not only the socialists and communists, but also the Sokół movement, which was a kind of a paramilitarist also organization related to training. And actually, Sokół, the socialists and the Olympic Committee, they were supported by Masaryk, Tomasz Masaryk, and they could show the displays and organize the sporting events in the Strachów Stadium, which was built in the 1926, and right now it's abandoned, unfortunately, but it's still the biggest stadium in the world. But the communist fraction of the workers' sport movement in Czechoslovakia was banned. I mean, not banned, they could operate, but they could not organize the second Spartakiad. The first one was an accident that it happened, but the second Spartakiad was banned and they didn't receive the Strachów Stadium, and they needed to create their own. So this is how those sketches by Jaromir Krejčar appeared on the pages of Red. He also wanted to create a movable stadium, which is also very interesting. This stadium was supposed to be dismantled and then also built in another occasion. So on the pages of Red, even on the cover, as you see, we see here the fragment of the stadium of Jaromir Krejčar for the second Spartakiad. And here also the sketches, the stadium of the second Spartakiad, which unfortunately was cancelled by the government, but the avant-garde artists related to the seal, they wanted to be involved in this event. So there were also some postcards were created for the event, even if it didn't happen. I mean, the postcards were already created in the 1927, 1926. And as you see, they are sometimes very avant-garde, like this one. When we think about the Gustav Kručí's, for example, postcards of the Spartakiad, this was created 2 years before Kručí's, and shows like how the typography and the letter and the movement of the human body correspond to each other. And also, for example, this event, this postcard, which is also like a photomontage based. Those are maybe not the best art by Wacław Maszek, who was a member of the Communist Party. I mean, he collaborated with the Red Seal artists, but was not a member of the group. So, this is about Czechoslovakia. I will come to the Soviet Union, how the avant-garde artists were supporting the Red Sport International. And here I would like to focus on the main president of the Red Sport International, the organization which was founded in 1921, Nikolai Podwojski, who wrote that sport was about involving as many young workers and peasants as possible in physical education and shooting practice, link physical and military training with communist education. The Red Sport International embraces all worker and peasant sports organizations which support the proletarian class struggle. Physical culture, gymnastics, games and sport are means of proletarian class struggle, not an end themselves. So we can see here the military kind of message related to the activity of the Red Sport International. And actually, this is what Podwojski did. He had a very good contacts with the avant-garde artists, especially those from Hutemas school, and also with Meyerhold, Civil Meyerhold, and together with Meyerhold, they intend to organize the physical training together for the Red Army, like together with Meyerhold, using his system of theater outdoor training. It had to be also used by the soldiers. But of course, maybe I will not talk much about Hutemas because you all know about the school, but I think the most important thing related to the Red Sport International is that Podwojski contacted the school, and especially the Nikolai Ladowski, who was a head of the architecture department in Hutemas, and starting from the 1924, during the architecture faculty, the students were aimed to develop the architectural projects for the International Red Stadium. Because the idea of the International Red Stadium was to host the first Spartakiad in Moscow, and it had to be the most extravagant and the biggest stadium in the world, of course, which was not only supposed to host the sporting events, but also theater displays and open-air festivals. The Ladowski developed one project of the International Red Stadium, but also some students, including Mikhail Korzew, who was a very avant-garde architect, and he created some sketches for the International Red Stadium, 1925, 1926. It was also the time when Lisicki came back to Moscow and also was a professor at the Hutemas. And he was amazed by those projects. And most probably, I mean, this is not certain, but those two works were most probably created for those sketches of Mikhail Korzev. But it's not certain, I cannot justify it. But he created design projects, the so-called photomurals for International Red Stadium, which is the runner in the city and the footballers, his famous works. I will not go into the detail because I still would like to talk about Hungary, but this what is very important to when we think about the first stadium of the Spartakiad. Despite of a lot of projects and sketches, like none of the Hutemas projects was realized. Of course, it was too utopian in a way, but very moderate and like very kind of traditional here stadium of Dynamo was erected in 1928. It still exists, but right now, after the World Cup, it looks horrible. I will not talk about the details, but it was designed by the very moderate architects Arkady Langman and Lazar Sherikofer to host the first Spartakiad. So the first Spartakiad, first All-Union Spartakiad in Moscow, organized by Red Sport International in 1928, was meant to be the biggest sporting event in the history of the world. So I found it very interesting when we think about the posters, for example, of the Olympic Games in Paris and the one of the first Spartakiad by Sergei Vlasov. We see, I think it's kind of a mocking play between both of these images, because a javelin thrower was pictured here in Paris poster alone against the most important and known landmarks of Paris, including the Sacré-Cœur and Eiffel Tower. He stand with his back and concentrated on gaining an individual record. In contrary to this, Vlasov's Spartakiad poster from 1928 depicts a javelin thrower who is exposed to the viewer and joined by male and female athletes, which we see here, and from all over, like with the also different races. You can see also the Asians there, and kind of a global scope of athletes. And the Moscow landmarks are the Mausoleum of Lenin, which is here, and the kind of constructivist buildings. So it's not about tradition or individual at all. Here I would like to also quote one of the organizers of the first Spartakiad, who wrote that our Spartakiad is sharply distinct from the bourgeois Olympics, now taking place in Amsterdam. At those games there is an attempt to achieve victories at any cost and establish new records. Defending national honor with specially prepared athletes is an end in itself. The Spartakiad has the task of demonstrating physical culture and sport as one form of preparing workers in the struggle for socialism. And of course, the most known works related to the Spartakiad are those photomontages and postcards by Gustav Hlutis, which I found also very interesting how many scholars are depicting them, because one can read that those postcards depict Spartakiad, but it was not possible because it was a vision of the Spartakiad by Hlutis, because he produced them before Spartakiad was actually held in Moscow. So he produced those postcards still before the first Spartakiad. I don't know how much he knew about Spartakiad, what was going on, if all those disciplines will be featured or not. But this is Gustav Hlutis' vision of the Spartakiad, but the Spartakiad did not look like that. And he just like cut out from the sports press before the Spartakiad. This what also is important for those Spartakiads. We see the inscription RSI, the Red Sport International, the Spartakiad, and the Moscow. You can see also the women and men together. As you remember, I was talking at the beginning that the Olympic Games did not allow women to participate until 1928, actually. And we see the female discus thrower. When we think about the art and sport, we also always think about Discoveries by Miron, so the very important sculpture from the ancient Greece. But we have here a female discus thrower, so someone else who is even bigger than the Lenin, who is rising up. I mean, he's coming up from the mausoleum because he died in 1924. He's coming back to life. The mausoleum is also crooked, so he just like came out to life, and he's looking at the crowds who are joining the first Spartak. I found very interesting and important this. You do not see it here. This postcard, which has a very clear military connotations of the Spartak, because you can see here that jeder Arbeiter, Sportler muss sein ein Soldat der Revolution. So every workers athlete needs to be a soldier of the revolution. And you can see like women with the rifles, men, everyone shooting at the target. And here it's not so clearly, you do not see it so clearly, but it's like a person in a Ku Klux Klan, this kind of hat. And they are aiming to shoot. So when we think about the first Spartakiad, also shooting was very important there. I mean, also when we think about the sports disciplines during the Olympic Games, there's also shooting. I mean, shooting or biathlon. Like it's also a military training actually. So it has always some kind of connotations with military. But I found it very important and interesting to direct the attention of this. Of course, the red color is very important here, and also the palette of colors, which is kind of Mondrianesque in a way. I mean, here maybe it's green, so maybe not so Mondrianesque. The other one, he's using only 5 colors actually in those Spartakiads, which are actually the colors of the Olympic flag. But this is another topic. So now I would like to come to the Hungarian avant-garde and the worker sports in Budapest, and to look upon the circle around Munka and Lajos Kaszak, one of the leaders of the Hungarian avant-garde, where also in a magazine, the avant-garde magazine Munka, photo montage appeared showing Spartakiad, and it was hailed as one of the most important sporting events. And this what I found also very interesting, that after Lajos Kaszak came from Vienna back to Hungary, to Budapest, he started to be connected with the sporting worker sports club called MTE. And they are pictured here in Munka's Sportolog. It's like the workers' sports, and describing their activities on the pages of his magazine. Even still before, when Lajos Kaszak was in Vienna and edited a magazine Ma, he wrote, I would like to quote here, "If we were to ask what sport means today and how it affects individuals and large masses, then the answer would be simple. Today's sport is a manifestation of war. It's something special for the individual and a dangerous drug for the masses. But if we ask what organizational benefits we can draw from the conscious control of sporting obsession, then we can answer that sport is a new social order that carries the basic principles of a collective human community, as it captivates both individuals and great masses." So this article was published in 1924 during the Olympic Games in Paris, where he criticized Olympic Games, and it was a very kind of important statement of him, and kind of it foreshadowed his interest in worker sport after he will come back to Budapest. So those photographs, which appeared in the magazine Munka and showed the Workers' Club from Budapest, the MTE. I'm sorry, I forgot the Hungarian name of this club. It's so difficult. It's like Magyarország. I'm sorry, I'm not a Hungarian specialist of the names, but those photographs were created by the athletes themselves. And it's also there written that workers amateur photography. So to show that like not only avant-garde artists are creating something for the workers, but also workers photography is included in the avant-garde journal, which was Munka. Because actually the club MTE from Budapest was a club which also had an affiliation of photographers, and they also had an MTE photo group. They not only had an MTE sports club but also a photo group, and they organized, for example, exhibition also together with the Munka circle by Lajos Kaszak. And here one of the statements I would like to quote by Lajos Gro, who was a member of MTE Club and the photo group, and he wrote it in the magazine Munka, edited by Lajos Kaszak. Today there are already thousands of workers who take photos in their free time. Using every opportunity and with help of the lens, one should capture from a socialist point of view everyday life events so that these photos, apart from entertainment, express a new human view, are partly a weapon in the class struggle and partly a historical document of the workers' movement. So actually the goal was also to not only create the art for workers, but also workers' art, which was photography. Because Lajos Kaszak, especially in the 1930s, he abandoned like painting, and he said that the main medium for the workers should be photography, because in his view photography is objective and very easy to learn, not like painting, for example. So actually the MTE club from Budapest, they also organized theater performances, so they had not only a photo group but also a theater group, and they were kind of very much close to the idea of the collective workers' culture, which was central also for the Lajos Kaszak, especially in the 1930s. So this was only a kind of a brief presentation, but to give you a little bit of glimpse into the book, and also to the topic of and the problems, how to connect the workers' sports movement with also avant-garde experimentation. I also would like to maybe ask the question here, as we are in Belgium, what about the third Workers' Olympics in Antwerp in 1937, which was, as I mentioned before, the last Workers' Olympics which united socialists and communists? And were there any like avant-garde artists interested in Belgium in that event, or did not have any resonance? But of course we can discuss. If you have like any questions, I think workers' sport was very central to the Central Europe and the USSR. How was it in Belgium? It was very important to research. I didn't get to that point, that's why I make it clearly it's 1920 and 1932, so that the people will not ask me what about Antwerp. I didn't have, unfortunately, time to study that topic, but it may be interesting also for the group here to look upon this topic in another way. Thank you.